Okay. Last time when I was talking about this whole change that's occurring during the monarchy, change in perception, change in values, change in attitude, I pointed out that a lot of it's actually generated by a combination of the chiefs, specifically Kamehameha on one hand, but it's also because you have this European influenced population of traders and such coming in. The missionaries come in at sort of the end of this whole mess, if you want to call it that, in 1821 from New England. This is a very peculiar group, and so I'm gonna have to spend about 10 or 15 minutes to do this. I've never come up with a good PowerPoint for this. The guys that come over here are part of a group that you guys probably remember from the images of Thanksgiving. These are the Puritans that come out of England, and they're actually what we call Calvinist. So they're not part of one of the mainstream Protestant religions. They're part of a very almost cult-like splinter group that originally starts up in Switzerland or someplace like that, gets thrown out of there in some cases, though you still find a lot of the Calvinists in Switzerland. It's still a major issue. They end up in Holland. They get thrown out of there pretty much. They end up in England. They end up in England just before the English Civil War. They're a huge factor in that. At the end of that, they become so intolerable that everyone just started asking them to get their ass out, and so they end up in New England. These are the folks that come over as the Puritans. They're the ones that settle in Massachusetts, and they form the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So they were never seen as one of the mainstream American versions of Christianity. They're always very much a fringe element. And they changed their name in many cases because of this sort of bad PR. They change it from the Calvinist, which is what they were, and they oftentimes call themselves Congregationalist. By the time of the late 1700s, they have lost all their power politically. Massachusetts, they did such a bad job of running the place, and they were so intolerant that the British actually, when it was a colony, the British actually sent in troops and took it from them, and made it a formal British crown colony because of the abuses that the Calvinists were laying down. If you ever want to read this, this is the Nathaniel Hawthorne Scarlet Letter, is the Puritans. As we'll see, just a real odd group in a lot of ways. By the late 1700s, what they've done is, and we'll see this, they've gone into education. So what they do is they've now become the big ones pushing public education, and the idea that people have to be literate and stuff like that. And they've gotten out of what you might call missionizing through religion. Their last big sort of bang, because by the late 1700s, they're non-force in the United States religiously. They're pretty much a non-force politically in a visible way. But they still had this real strong attitude of missionizing. They're the ones that hear about what's going on in Hawaii from Hawaiians who have come over as sailors to New England and stuff. And so they set up this New England Missionary Society for the purpose of bringing Calvinist Christianity to the Pacific. And that's the group of folks that end up here landing in Hawaii in 1821. Now, this is the thing that's sort of important to remember, is these are not normal Protestant missionaries. These aren't Lutherans or Methodists or any other, Presbyterians. These aren't the big groups that made up American society. So one of the weird things is when you're looking at the missionaries that end up here who are coming from the United States, is they're not coming from the United States in terms of being representing the norm. They're coming from the United States representing a pretty strange splinter group that's only found in a couple of states. Largely Massachusetts at the time. So what Hawaiians and what the chiefs think are normal Americans are pretty weird. And so the Congregationalists become the religious group here in Hawaii. Among other things, they're very intolerant of any other form of Christianity. So they convince the chiefs, specifically Kaumanu, to throw the Catholics out who are trying to show up, to throw out the Protestants. Any other group of Christians aren't allowed in for about 20 years, while the Congregationalists pretty much make it their place. By the time that's done, they've managed to plug themselves so intimately into the monarchy that the monarchy in Hawaii is really sort of a Calvinist Congregationalist monarchy. It's that version of Christianity that persists right down to the 20th century here. And you still see it. Until a couple of years ago, you could not make alcohol here, like rum. Though, of course, we're one of the world's largest sugar producers, which you make rum out of. And the reason for that is the Congregationalists were one of the groups that thought that alcohol was the demon's drink. And they convinced the monarchy to try to make that illegal. When we became a territory, they were still a powerful religious force, and they made that. So Hawaii was one of the few places in the United States you couldn't make alcohol. And this became really silly because in the 1990s, what you had, and I remember this, we were working a little bit with Maui Land and Pine, and they were going to convert their sugar production over to alcohol production for ethanol, for fuel, as an alternative to importing gasoline. And they actually set up the plant. They were getting ready to go. And then all of a sudden they were told, oh, by the way, in the state of Hawaii, you can't make hard alcohol. You can make beer, but you can't make anything with any more alcohol content because of this law that went all the way back to the 1830s in the monarchy. And everyone started like, what? And they checked, and sure enough, that was exactly you know, that finding was modified, I think, in about 10 years ago. Now you can actually make alcohol for energy purposes, but you still can't make hard liquor in most of the Hawaiian Islands. So if you ever buy something like Hana rum or anything else that says it's rum from Hawaii, it's bottled here, but it's not made here. We're the only place in the United States that I know that has that. That's a reflection of this really strange group of folks. So when you're looking at Christianity and the missionaries here in Hawaii, they're not normal missionaries, and they're not part of the normal mainstream effort. In a modern context, I suppose it'd be sort of like Jehovah's Witnesses or Seventh-day Adventists, that they're very much a sort of unusual group with a very different set of views about what Christianity is. So to sort of segue out, let's take a look at them, because it's hard to understand what happens in the monarchy and how things go wrong unless you understand where these guys are coming from. Okay. So this is a chart. It's in your stuff in the thing. This is the Calvinist, and what I did is the easiest way to explain the Calvinist is to contrast them to the Hawaiians' social values. The Calvinists came from a very peculiar branch of Christianity. Like a lot of other groups in the 1600s, they were an anti-Catholic movement. John Calvin was the original founder of the movement. He absolutely detested the Catholic Church. He detested what the Catholic Church stood for and the way that he got involved in politics. He did not like the structure of the Catholic Church. His view of Christianity was a very fundamentalist, very conservative, even by the period standards view. Is that his view would be very much like what people oftentimes see as a stereotype of fundamentalist Islam. His view is the Bible was literally the word of God being spoken. So in that view, when you were reading the Bible, you were talking directly to God, and God was talking directly to you. Now, one of the fascinating aspects, of course, is he was talking about the Bible translated into German, then of course later into English. So, when you think about it, he's not talking about reading it in Hebrew, the way it was originally written. He was actually talking about it in translated form, but somehow, I guess he figured the translations were still literally the word of God. So in the Calvinist view, one was this idea that the Bible was the only thing that you needed to know. But along with that, Calvin was very convinced that when people were born in sin. We were basically the children of the devil. And therefore, every individual is given a chance by God to become good and go to heaven. But that chance is something that you have to work at. And this was the function of the Bible. The purpose of the Bible was to test people on whether they were good enough to go to heaven or whether they were going to go to hell, which is where they actually belonged. So it's a very different view of Christianity than almost any other group. So the key part about Calvinism, one of the really key principles then, is this idea of individualism. In Calvinist Christianity, every individual is responsible for their salvation. Now, what this also means then is you can't have mass. You can't have something where a priest says, I absolve you of your sins or something like that. Confession makes no sense. Everyone is entirely responsible on their own 2 feet for getting to heaven. And the guidebook for that, and the only way to do that is through that text, i.e. the Bible. And these become the key principles of Calvinism. So the first really key one is the fact that Calvinist view of Christianity was that every individual is responsible for their own salvation. Now, what this also means, among other things, is no point having a priest, because every individual has to read the Bible and figure out through the Bible how they're going to get to heaven. So it doesn't do any good for someone else to tell you how they did it, because that's them, that's not you. So this is like an uber individualistic way of looking at the world. Calvin was very fixated. I'm not sure what this is about or where it comes from. You'd have to go ask one of the religion folks about where this guy comes from. He was very fixated on the idea that prayer could not be done in church. Prayer was something that you did individually while you were reading the Bible or doing stuff related to, trying to get on the good side of God. In that, he became convinced that working, actual physical labor, like sweating and working in a field and stuff like that, that was actually a form of prayer. So you didn't have to sit there and go through mantras in your head or say things like that. You would actually do this through physical effort. So physical effort impressed God. God liked people working. So therefore, when you're working, you're actually doing prayer. So you could basically, it made more sense to be working in a field than going to church, because in that way you were actually doing what you should be doing to get to heaven. Somewhere along the line in the 1600s, both in England and then in the United States, what happens is this modifies itself, and what it becomes is time spent at work versus physical labor. I think as people became more urbanized, a lot of Calvinists were working in jobs where you didn't actually physically get sweaty if they're like an accountant or something like that, but they were spending time working. So what happens is by the 1700s, Calvinists become convinced that spending time working is a form of prayer rather than actual physical labor. And so what happens is they get very fixated on time, but you have to have a certain amount of time spent working. So for example, the idea of an 8 to 5 job that you guys are in class for an hour and eventually you get 3 class credits. This is all part of this time orientation and labor, which the Calvinist was morality. So you have to remember that for the Calvinist, time spent working was morally a good thing, God approved. If you're messing around and not doing anything and not working, that's actually the devil. And so you get these old slogans in American society that idle hands are the devil's hands, all sorts of weird old slogans from the Calvinists that are still around about the need to be working. And what you find is that's peculiar to the Calvinists. That wasn't part of the sort of mainstream Protestant or Catholic view of it. They don't have this idea that time and labor is somehow related to being a good person. That's the Calvinist. And so you still see this very strongly with when people are viewing the homeless or a lot of the way people are feeling right now because they're out of work, that's somehow a bad thing. Never mind, they didn't make it happen, it happened to them. That's actually the Calvinist view of the world. If you're not working, you're going to go to hell. If you don't spend as much time as possible working, you're going to go to hell. The more time you spend working, the more you're liable to go to heaven. So this idea of a time-work synergy and the two of them being together is a huge part of the Calvinist way of looking at stuff. And so what they end up with is this incredibly strong work ethic, because in their view, the work ethic wasn't so much to impress others, it's to make sure you get to heaven. Because they're so fixated on the Bible as an actual text document to talk to God, because everyone has to talk to God by themselves, it doesn't do me any good to read the Bible to you guys. In their view of it, you would have to be able to read so that you can read the Bible yourself and the Bible can talk to you. So this is one of those groups that, for example, very frequently, if they weren't sure what to do in a situation, they would take a Bible, literally drop it on a table so it fell open. And they would just look at it, whatever phrase they saw first would be God talking to them. That's the way they saw it. So in their view, you had to be literate. If you couldn't read, you couldn't go to heaven because you couldn't read the Bible. And it doesn't do any good for someone else to read it for you because you have to find the parts of the Bible that you need to talk to God yourself. So everyone had this intersection with God through this text. So what happens is right from the get-go, they're really, really big on literacy. But it's not literacy so that you can read a newspaper or an Instagram blog post or something like that. It's literacy for the purpose of talking to God through the Bible. So to them, there was no difference between religion, prayer, and reading a book. It was all the same thing, or reading the book, I guess they'd say. Now, what happens in the 1600s on, in places like Massachusetts, where they're a major power there initially, is they set up public schools, because in their view of the world, if you teach everyone how to read and you give them access to a Bible, then you've given everyone the ability to go to heaven. If they don't choose to take it, if they don't learn to read, or if they don't read the Bible or whatever, then that's their choice and they go to hell. But you've given them the option. So very early on, these guys start to equate the idea of education with a mission. So to them, a mission wasn't a church, a mission was a school. And it's not by accident that New England, specifically Massachusetts, ends up with the first public education system in the world. Because if you were going to be a missionary for the Calvinists, you were a teacher. You weren't someone preaching in a pulpit. You weren't like, I don't know if it's, I think it's Jehovah's Witnesses that hand out the pamphlets on the street corners and stuff. That isn't these guys' way of doing it. In their view, you sit kids down or adults down, you teach them how to read, you give them access to a Bible, and you've actually done God's work. So these guys saw schools as their version of missionizing in churches. And this becomes hugely important because when these guys come to here as missionaries in 1821, the first thing they do is they set up schools. And the schools are actually tied into their chapels. And so from the get-go, from the Hawaiian standpoint, this is fantastic. You've got a group of people that are bringing in a religion, but they're also figuring out how to write Hawaiian for you. They're writing books in Hawaiian, though the first book is the book of, I think, Proverbs, and then the second book was to translate the Bible into Hawaiian. But as far as the Hawaiians were concerned, this was great because here were people that were willing to, for free, teach you and teach an entire population how to be literate. From the Calvinist standpoint, the Congregationalist standpoint, this was fantastic because here you had a population that wanted to learn. When they were setting up schools in the mainland United States, they got a lot of pushback because, you know, for a lot of the areas of the colonies and then later the United States, public education was sort of an iffy thing. A lot of people weren't sure if they wanted everyone to be literate, for one thing. Second, you have to admit literacy in Europe doesn't occur until the late 1800s. A lot of the population in places like England wasn't literate until the 1860s. So literacy in the United States occurs a lot earlier than it does in Europe. But it was also part of this sort of manifesto of this particular religion. One of the weird side effects of this is when you look at American education, even today in 2020, it's based in Calvinist logic. So if you go over to St. Louis, for example, who are a perfect example, on one hand, they're a Catholic school. On the other hand, they've got the most confusing schedule. I think they have a Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule, and Tuesday, Thursday, or ever a 3-day schedule or some weird thing like that, where depending on what day of the week it is and what week it is, you go to classes at different times. So on one day you go to class from maybe 8 to 9:20, and then all of a sudden you have that class again on Tuesday from 10 to something like that. So you've got this really weird situation, but this is part of the Calvinist thing. One, they want to teach you how to be literate, but two, they want you to be time disciplined. They want you to get used to the idea that work is a good thing. And so they structure everything in the world. So they become the center of American education. American education in 2020 is still Calvinist. It's got recesses, it's got times scheduled for certain types of learning, and you measure people's success by the number of hours they've taken in something. So knowledge is actually based on the amount of time. It's not based on actually something you've learned that you can show. This is very, very Calvinist. Okay. In their view of the world, typical with most of the Christian populations, they very much see man in a position of dominance vis-a-vis everything else. God makes man in his image, and then everything else comes afterwards. I think of Noah and the ark. So in that situation, it's a very human-centric world. With the Calvinists, probably even more so, because of course they've got this big thing on individualism. So they're huge into individualism. They're huge into this idea of man being a special place in the universe. And they've got this whole sort of work ethic. Now, one of the side effects of this is the Calvinists are really big on clocks. And this is one of the things you see in the United States that you don't see if you go to a lot of Europe. If you go to some place like France or other places like that that didn't see the Calvinists, you don't find a lot of clocks in the house. If you look at Americans, and again, remember that one of the stereotypes of the Swiss who are Calvinists is the great watches they make. Calvinists were really big on keeping time. If you look at a Catholic or other type of church, there's a church steeple. A Calvinist steeple will always have a clock in the front. Because again, the time spent doing stuff became more important than what you actually do. So having a 9-to-5 job means that you actually have the job and you're a good person because you have a job and it works from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. There's not really a lot of examination in what you're actually doing in that job. It becomes the hours spent working or the hours spent in school. It's the hours. So it's a time thing. Because Calvinists are individualistic, because Calvinists are very big into work, it's not surprising that very early on they also get, and this is one of the reasons they're successful in Europe, and the Swiss again are a good example, is that Calvinists became very convinced that acquiring things and having those things and showing other people you had those things was actually God's intent. Because if you're hardworking, then you should be able to make more money and you should have a nicer house, et cetera, et cetera. And that should encourage your neighbors to do the same thing because they can see that that means that a wealthy person with a nice house and a good living and a lot of stuff is going to go to heaven in the Calvinist view. Someone who's not working as hard, has a crappy house and doesn't have a car and stuff like that, they're going to go to hell because they didn't work hard enough to go to heaven. So in the Calvinist view, the amount of stuff you have and the manifestations of publicly of those things is part of the display that shows that you're a good moral person. And you see this a lot in American society. There's a very strong attitude in American society that the more stuff you have, the more powerful, the more wealthy you are, the better you are. And the converse is also true. If you don't have stuff and you don't work hard and stuff like that, then you're a bad person. This is not the way that a lot of European societies see this. This is a peculiarly Calvinist thing. And because they run the education system from the 1600s on, it permeates the school system and it permeates what Americans learn from the time they're little kids. So prosperity, success, and morality become the same thing in American society. So consumerism becomes a key part of Calvinist religion. And it's still a key part of American society. Now, what this also means, if everyone has to go to heaven as an individual, then it's not your job to worry about your neighbors. Everyone's got to take care of their own messes and their own troubles. And this also means in a more grim way that, you know, if you're a good salesperson and you sort of skirt the edges and you screw people out of money, but you do it because you're so clever at it, because you have talked them out of stuff and because you have a lot of things, you're actually a good person. If the other person was dumb enough to give you that money, then that means they're at fault, so therefore they should go to hell. So what you end up is a very strong attitude of what we call negative reciprocity, which means that you can take advantage of anyone, and if you do, it's their fault for letting you do it. It's not your fault for doing it. That's very different than most of the other forms of Christianity, which have this very strong sense that, you know, there's a sense of sort of obligation to do the right thing. In the Calvinist view, the right thing is the most success to me. So this me-ism is an enormous part. And of course, this mod still is classically American society, and this is how everyone else sees Americans, is a me place. And that's, again, these guys, you know, part of that. In this view of it, because the Bible is a standard text, and there's the 10 Commandments and all the rest of that, as most of the other forms of Christianity, there's a very strong sense of what we call generalized morality. Therefore, everyone has the same set of moral rules. Everyone has the same set of understanding, especially because they can read and have the Bible in front of them. Therefore, you can sit there and score everyone else on how good of a person they are. And of course, in the Calvinist sense, that's by virtue of the stuff they have. Not the amount of hours they spend in church, but the amount of things they have, the amount of education they have, the amount of goodies they have, the size of their house, all that stuff allows you to score people that you do not know at all, simply by virtue of these manifestations. Okay, and that's what we call generalized morality. You can rank strangers, and of course you see this hugely in social media where someone gets dissed on. In this situation, family's not important. Even your twin brother and sister, your nephews, nieces, your parents, they all have to go to heaven on their own merits. Being a good family person doesn't score any points with the Calvinist. Okay. So Calvinists are not interested in family. It's not relevant to them. Well, they don't see it as having anything to do with going to heaven. With all of this, they have a very strong sense of this idea of being ethnocentric, but in their case, it's probably religious-centric. If you're not a Calvinist, especially if you know how to read and you have the Bible in front of you, then you're a really bad person. So the Calvinists are one of those fringe groups that actually would see other Christians as being more bad than folks who had another religion. If you're Buddhist, for example, and living in Malaysia and you've never seen the Bible, then the Calvinists would cut you slack because you haven't had access to the Word of God. If, on the other hand, you're an Irish Catholic and you have access to the Bible and you've chosen to be Catholic instead of Calvinist, then you've automatically got to go to hell. So this is an incredibly intolerant group. They have absolutely no flexibility. Again, if you read Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, you can see that all the way through it. This is why they genocide the Indians in New England. They don't have any tolerance for anyone other than themselves, especially if you have access to it. And this eventually becomes an issue with the Hawaiians. They give the Hawaiians literacy, in their view. They give the Hawaiians the Bible. But then the Hawaiians don't buy into the Calvinist thing the whole way, as we'll see. And the end result is the Calvinists feel totally free to totally diss on the Hawaiians and say, you guys are failures, you're all going to go to hell and you're bad people because we gave you these things and you didn't take them the way you're supposed to. Therefore, you're evil and you're the devil's children. And that becomes some of the spin you see with the concept of the stereotypes of Hawaiians in the 19th and especially the 20th century down till today. Is there, if you don't do these things, you're automatically bad. So they make the traditional Hawaiian system evil, versus before where it just been different. Yeah, okay, that's enough of those. So if we look at the other half of this, and this would be the Hawaiian system. So these are Hawaiian normative values. And if you look at the Hawaiian side, Hawaiians are group oriented, as all Polynesian societies are. The group is more important than the individual. We can see for the Calvinists that doesn't make any sense. To them, the individual's got to be important and the group's irrelevant. Probably the most important, and you see this depending on where you grew up, what your background is. I grew up in a society very much like Hawaiian in some ways. So in that situation, we're very task-oriented. And this is still the system I work under, which is basically you have a list of things you've got to get done. You hierarchy and you do number one first. When you're done with number one, you do number two. When you're done with number two, you do number three. It doesn't matter how much time you spend at it. Our company, if we were out in the field, you leave early in the morning and you stay till whatever you guys had figured you were going to get done, you get done. If that means you come back in the dark, you do. You don't get people saying at all of a sudden 4:30, oh man, it's 4:30, it's time to go home. That time orientation of the Calvinists doesn't make any sense in the Hawaiian sense. The Hawaiian sense is based on things that you have to do, I would call task orientation. When you're done with a task, then you can relax. In the Calvinist view, it's the time that you spend doing stuff that's critical. So two very different ways of looking at something as simple as what you do when you work. And this is still a huge conflict point here in Hawaii. Polynesian societies in general still are very task-oriented, not just Hawaiians, but Samoans, Tongans, etc. The Calvinists are the antithesis of that. Those two groups don't get along. And I know because we've hired people that are very, classically American, and they can't work with us because they wanted to say, it's time to, we're pal, it's 4:30, it's time to go home. And it's like, well, we haven't finished what we're supposed to do. That doesn't make any difference, it's time to go home. It's fine, you're fired. There's two different ways of looking at how you do stuff. And they're a huge source of conflict even today. What this also means is this is why Hawaiians are seen as being late all the time. The classic stereotypes of Hawaiian time, which we've probably more accurately called Polynesian time, is the fact that time is less important than task. If you've got something you got to do, you get it done, then you go whatever else you're supposed to do next. You don't sit there and worry about, oh no, I've got to leave the meeting because I'm supposed to be somewhere at 9 o'clock, for example. Two very different views of this, and this is still a huge stereotypic issue in Hawaii. As with other Pacific Island societies, Hawaiians didn't have literacy initially, so therefore the spoken word was mana, as we've seen. So the written word has never been as important to Hawaiians as the spoken word. The idea of chant, for example, you can't write out a chant and have the written chant be as powerful as the spoken chant. In the Calvinist view, the written word takes precedence over the spoken word. So if you want to see this in a contract situation, I should point this also very true in Asia. In Asian societies are very much like Hawaiian society. So in Asian societies, if I have a contract with Japanese, like one of the contracts I do have with Japanese, that's originally done, we agreed that verbally. Eventually we end up with a written version of the contract, but everyone's agreed to it verbally, so therefore it's done. Now, for someone coming from an American Calvinist background, if there's a written version of the contract and there's changes in it, it doesn't matter what we said verbally, the written form is the final form of the contract. So this is a huge problem for specifically Hawaiians here, where someone tells them something and they sign something thinking that's what they were told, and then someone, if they're being clever, actually has different things in the written form, and from a Hawaiian context, you wouldn't think of writing it because the spoken form was actually the legal form. In American society, the written form is more legal than the spoken form. It takes precedence. And again, this is your Calvinist. In the Hawaiian system, as with, again, Polynesians and, well, Pacific Island societies in general, other animal forms and such that we've seen with the idea of the clan are actually more important. People are not in a such situation of dominance. People are the children of, for example, of the Dalo. People are the children of particular ancestors. We're very much down the hierarchy versus being at the top of it. So again, when you're talking about things like environmental issues or relationships that people have with the land, it's going to be very, very different. The Haole version, the Anglo-American version, is going to be the idea of stewardship, which you see with like nature conservancy would be a good example of a very Calvinist way of looking at stuff. You take over property, you manage it because people are in a position to make decisions about stuff. From a Hawaiian context, that doesn't make a lot of sense because people actually aren't in a position of superiority. So oddly, what you're going to find is Hawaiians don't have the same concept oftentimes of environmental protection or segregation or whatever that you're going to see from sort of an Anglo-American context. Consumerism, Again, this is a classic stereotype of Pacific Islanders, specifically Polynesians. Giving out resources to support the social network of your family is more important than having a lot of stuff. So folks that are stereotypically Hawaiian might have a fairly small house, but they're helping 8 people out. Their classic stereotypic, sort of Calvinist Anglo-American counterpart would have a really big house and not really helping anyone out. And so the judgment, if you're going to actually look at consumerism, is Hawaiians are always going to fail. Because even if they're working very hard and making a lot of money, they're not going to be displaying it necessarily. It's going to be a social network of people that depend on them, but that's not going to be manifested in objects. And again, you see this becomes one of the negative things about Pacific Islanders, specifically Polynesians. The classic sort of Anglo stereotype is they can't handle their money well, which means they don't spend it on themselves. In Hawaiian society and Polynesian, balanced reciprocity is the way that things work. And this actually is the local system we have here because the other groups largely practice this also. I do something for Shota, and there's an attitude that he now owes me the equivalent back. So there's this idea you do something that's like, think of a scale. Someone does someone a favor, then that favor should be repaid. And the way that we operate here is very much within that context of balanced reciprocity. You're always doing favors for people, and there's an attitude in the back of your head that now those favors are there and you can sort of store them as like IOUs, and then you can ask that person, I need help, can you help me out? And they have to because they owe you for those past favors. So the whole world consists of a network of social relationships and giving and receiving, which is, antithetical to the idea of negative reciprocity, where you basically take advantage of people for your own gain. So let's think of the idea of profit as negative reciprocity. This idea of generalized morality that's so much a part of the sort of Anglo-American system, specifically the Calvinist. In Hawaii and in Asian societies, what we have is what we call situational morality. You judge people based on that particular situation and what led up to it. You don't have a set of templates that apply to everyone all the time. So for example, in the Anglo-American system, theft is automatically bad because it's theft. In the Hawaiian system, theft might be bad in one situation, but in another situation, it might be the only way to resolve something. So you can't go and say theft is always bad. You have to know the situation to judge whether it was a good thing to do or a bad thing to do, which of course is sort of antithetical to the American legal system. So you can see where a lot of this stuff just crashes into each other. Family, extended family group network is absolutely key. The white man's burden idea that somehow folks like the Calvinist and folks from New England were innately superior. There is no equivalent to that because you have to remember in the Hawaiian system, as well as the Polynesian groups, they didn't have any experience with the outside world till the Europeans show up. So they were never in a position to compare themselves and grade themselves and score themselves relative to other groups until largely, the 19th and 20th centuries. So Hawaiian society doesn't have any tradition of being better because they never saw themselves in competition with anyone else. Other Hawaiians, yeah, which is why Hawaiians tend to be so competitive in the society, but not in the larger context because they didn't see themselves as part of a world order with a bunch of different type of people doing different things. And it still isn't a big thing with Hawaiians. Hawaiian society or Hawaiian identity still isn't based on an idea of superiority compared to anyone else, which is true of a lot of groups. Native Americans are very much the same way. So anyway, so sort of think this through, work this through. A lot of what is oftentimes identified as local here in the 21st century would actually fit closer to the Hawaiian, maybe not 100%, but close. This becomes stereotyped in the 19th and especially the 20th century and into the 21st century under the concept of haole. So the idea of what I would call mainland Anglo-American values are very much embedded in many ways in the United States in this idea of the Calvinist. So when these guys came over here, they were a splinter religious movement. But by the mid-19th century, this became American society, these sets of values, and they still very much are American society in 2020. I mean, you can see it's something as simple as the issue of wearing a mask. Makes a lot of sense from a Calvinist standpoint. From a Hawaiian standpoint, wearing a mask arguing about wearing a mask doesn't make any sense at all. So you see it a lot in the very issues that come up in the media every morning, like this morning again. Okay, so let's switch on to that. Okay, now the reason for that long-winded thing was to explain why this place ends up the way it does. It's because of this particular type of missionary that Hawaii ends up very different than, for example, what you find in a lot of the rest of the Pacific, where it's largely the London Missionary Society, which are Protestants or Anglicans. So in the rest of the Pacific, the people bringing Christianity don't have this real packaged value system the Calvinists do. They pretty much see themselves as bringing religion, but they're not as involved in changing the societal values of the group they bump into. Here in Hawaii, the Calvinists, you couldn't be part of their system unless you buy into the package of their values. So this is one reason why when you look at the monarchy and the period after that, what becomes sort of Hawaiian ethnic logic ends up looking fairly different than it would, say, in Samoa or Tonga, but it wouldn't have looked that different, say, 1770 or say even in 1810. It becomes that different because of the folks that basically become the other half of the monarchy system, which is the Calvinist Congregationalists. So this also explains why this commodification of everything. The chiefs and everyone are already involved in this, but of course the Calvinists come here and this is the way they view the whole world. They view the whole world in terms of the value of things. Now they're doing it because this is a moral religious thing, but it's also a value thing. Now this is also why the missionaries in most cases, very quickly after they arrive here from New England, most of the missionaries quit being missionaries within a couple of years, despite the fact that someone else paid for them to come over. They didn't pay their own way. They would get, some sort of a church, donation. So people in the church congregation would donate in New England, and these folks would volunteer, and then the church pays for them to come out to Hawaii. Many of them within 2 to 3 years, quit the church, stay here, become business people, and start making tons of money. And on one hand, the church is real pissed off because they're deserting them. On the other hand, when you think about it, if you're a Calvinist, that makes perfect sense. At some point, you don't really care that someone else paid your way. Your relationship to God is your own problem. And being wealthy is one of the fastest ways to get a good relationship with God. So suddenly deserting or breaking your contract with a group of people that paid for you is entirely legit, and people didn't lose any sleep about it. I don't think the Hawaiian government ever figured this out. And to be honest, I don't think Hawaiians even today have ever figured this out. In a Calvinist view, it's always me first. And so anything I do, regardless of whether I'm lying or BSing someone or actually stealing something from someone, as long as I can justify in terms of my own success, that's legit. And if you think about this, sometimes in American English is translated as sharp business practice. Even in a lot of Europe, it would be immoral business practice. Here, it's just being very clever. And on one hand, people go, oh, wow, these people were taken advantage of. On the other hand, there's a real sort of underlying American logic. Well, they were suckers, and therefore it's somehow their fault. So this commodification of everything just made the Calvinists totally happy. And of course, what happens very quickly is they then get embraced by the government and move in and start taking over the government, specifically the legal system, the finance ministry, and stuff like that under the monarchy. And of course, because they've got this very clear agenda of what they want, they very quickly shape the government by virtue of laws and things like that to be in a Calvinist model. By the 1850s, 1860s, the Calvinist Congregationalists here are arguing that Hawaii is actually more Calvinist than Massachusetts is, because they're able to manipulate the system. And the chiefs are sort of going along with it because they've got their own agendas for the things they want. As long as they're able to get the things they want, they're not paying enough attention to what's happening to the way the system works. So they're not paying attention to the fact that the rules are being shifted in a new direction because they're too busy playing their own sort of personal or family-based games, and they don't notice, or if they do notice, they don't take it seriously. And that's sort of where the monarchy falls apart in the last part of the 19th century, is the fact that the Hawaiian ari'i, who are in the monarchy or who have been in the monarchy, don't understand that it's no longer what they thought it was. It's now being modified to something from a group of people that have intrinsically totally different sets of values. And that becomes, manifest, for example, in the Bannock Constitution of the 1870s. Now, this finally comes to a crux with this whole Mahele thing. We didn't go over that in this class, right? Because I think I went over that with a 340 class yesterday. This doesn't sound familiar, does it? Okay, well, no one's responding, so I guess it doesn't. The Mahele was basically pressure put on the monarchy. The monarchy needs to look like a real country. By the 1830s, 1840s, the way that this becomes more and more desperate because they no longer have any way to generate revenue. The monarchy's broke, and there's no money coming in. They don't have any way that they can predict in every year what type of money they're going to have. And so basically, these folks that are now sort of in charge running the system, i.e. your Calvinist and Congregationalist guys, point out to them that any real country has private property ownership, because property is one of the easiest things to tax. If someone's actually got a piece of property, you can say, okay, you've got this property, it's worth this much. If you want to keep that property, you pay the government X amount of money and it's yours. This is much easier to tax than, for example, things like houses or cars or something like that. It's hard to tax that because it's hard to figure out where it is. It's easy to hide it. It's really hard to hide a piece of property. So it's basically the government's pointed out to them that if they want to look like a real country, if they want to look like a real independent sovereign country, you have to have property ownership, because that's how you're going to tax people, and that's how you're going to make money to pay for schools, harbors, military, whatever it is that governments have to do, including paying salaries. So basically, this finally comes to a crux, and this happens in the 1840s. It's called the Mahele, and it's basically the shift from all the land that was basically use owned to private ownership. And we'll get more into this next time. Let me show you what this looks like. Okay, here's our piece here. This is Pololo. And this is the LCA, or land corridor. This is the Mahele map for the whole sort of Ili of Pololo. Now, if we zoom in on here, see all these little areas here. Let me zoom in a little further. So here we see Mono, that's the guy's name. Land Court Award 1770. So in 1848, Mono was given this piece of property in Pololo. Now he had to go with testimony and basically say, okay, I own this piece of property. It goes from here, here, and there'd be fences or some markers to show where it went. The commission that was in charge said, okay, we agree. This is actually yours. So they gave him this land. So at that point, Mono now owns this piece of land. It's now his. Prior to 1848, 1850, all this land was owned by two chiefs, but they didn't actually own it. It was owned by nobody. It was owned by everybody. To a certain extent, I suppose you could argue that the king of Hawaii owned it. And then you had people working it. So these people were all living in the valley, but they didn't have ownership of property because the Hawaiians didn't have that concept. They had use rights to property. Mono probably had been, his family might have been in Pololo for who knows how long, and they'd probably always farmed this area, but it was always under the jurisdiction of the chiefs or, you know, whoever was in charge. So what happens in the 1840s, the government comes up and says, well, that system doesn't work anymore. We're going to change it to the idea of land ownership, which some of you guys should be familiar with. We now call this fee simple here in Hawaii. So what we're going to do is, you guys, if you want to own property, like all these spots up here, you have to go and you have to come to through a very structured setting. And Kilohana, for example, has to say, I own this piece of property. It's in Pololo. It's called such and such. It's got these boundaries on it. And this is mine. Ka'alu over here wanted a piece of property. Oponui wanted a piece of property. Oponui got two pieces of property here. Pupuava got a piece of property here. Mahoi got a bunch of property. You see his name all over the place. So there's all these folks are getting pieces. But if you notice this, what's really key, what becomes really critical to all this, and Pololo is sort of unusual. More of Pololo was actually claimed than almost any place else I've seen on Oahu. But if you notice, because if you go down here, okay, here's what's now Waialae Avenue. If you notice this whole lower section of Pololo, which probably had 50 or a couple hundred people living on it, there's no one that owns any of it except a guy named Kikio, who was one of the high chiefs here in Oahu. He's able to claim this whole area. And all the people living there now either had to leave or do whatever. In a lot of the areas on the islands of Oahu, and in fact all the Hawaiian Islands, you find that chiefs get big land claims. And a bunch of places don't get claimed at all. If you notice these two sections here, Pukele and what was originally called Kapuhulu, there's just big empty spots. They don't belong to anyone. No one claimed that property. And this actually becomes one of the huge problems in the Mahele, is that a huge proportion of the population did not understand what the idea of private property ownership was because they'd never had it. So therefore, when they're given this one window of time, which was only 2 years long, to do this, they didn't understand what it was, so they saw no reason particularly to do it. And then when they realized what it was too late. Once the Mahele happened, that was the end of the whole thing. You had this 1-2 year shot to prove that you had land ownership in someplace like Palolo. Once the hearings had gone through and the testimony had been accepted, they closed the doors on it. And if you're one of the families living over here and you didn't understand what it was, then all of a sudden in 1851, you look around, you have no property and you can't get property. You might still be living in the same place you've lived a couple of 100 years. But now, boop, it's gone. Palolo, something must have been going on because enough people understood that a lot of people made little claims. But when you look at these claims, they're actually pretty manini, they're pretty tiny. You know, a lot of these claims really are too small to be effective. This is probably 2 dalo patches each. This looks like it might be someone's house site. So what you find is some people took advantage of this, a lot of people didn't, and all of a sudden in 1852, a huge part of the population basically finds themselves dispossessed because once you've got private property ownership, you no longer have the idea of common property. So if you didn't get land during the Mahele, you're on the street. You might still be in a piece of property, but for example, everyone living down here, now Kikio can come up to you, he's now the landlord, and he can tell you, if you want to live in Palolo here, you're gonna have to pay for it. And people are looking at him like, why? I've been here for 300 years. And you go, I don't care, I own this. So the idea of ownership is the function of the Mahele. And this is something that the Hawaiian population never recovered from. This was probably more shattering than anything else that happened to Hawaiian society, was the loss of common land and the replacement with the idea of private property ownership. Now, of course, ironically, your Calvinist Congregationalists love this because you classically see this. You can live in Palolo, but if you're more successful, you buy property in Kahala or down in Hawaii Kai. And in doing so, or Aina, and you make a statement about your relative success. You might have the same square meters in Palolo or in Kalihi or something like that, but those square meters aren't worth as much as the same amount of square meters in Aina. So what happens is even where you live becomes commodified. And having property becomes a major form of commodification. And this is the enormous change that basically sort of rips apart Hawaiian society in the 19th century. When people lose control of land, they lose control of their future. And what happens in the monarchy is, with the best of intent, the Mahele basically just sort of shatters the social relationship that people had with each other and the social relationship people had with land. And that's sort of the big crux of the Mahele. Let's see if we got time to go through that. I'm not sure. Yeah, okay, we got time. Let me go through this real quickly. There's a bunch of stuff you can find. If you Google the Mahele, or even sometimes called the Great Mahele, you can find a whole mess of articles, there's videos, tons of stuff on this stuff. But the key thing that you have to remember that was really tricky, because there's actually nothing wrong with the design of the Mahele. The government knows it doesn't know what it's doing. So they actually hire a lawyer from San Francisco to come over here and help them set this up to make it as equitable as possible. The government was very aware that they had not done well by the Makainana. And by the 1840s, the government's very aware, because they've already been invaded and taken over by the British and the French once in 1839, 1843. So Kamehameha III is very aware that he's got to keep Hawaiians on his side, or else he's going to be a colony, just like Samoa and every place else. So in that situation, there's an enormous amount of pressure to do the right thing. But at the same time, he knows he's got to switch over to private property ownership because you need the tax revenues. So he sort of sees himself between a rock and a hard place. He's got to do this. He knows it's going to be disruptive. So that when they hire this guy, they basically say, okay, we want you to do this, but it has to be as fair as possible, and it has to cause as little disruption as possible. Otherwise, the French and the British will come in and take us over, make us a colony. One of the first things they did is, very specifically, you could not apply for land in the Mahele unless you were a citizen. Now you have to remember, and this is still a big part of Hawaiian values today, citizenship didn't mean blood Hawaiian. Citizenship meant that you were loyal to the monarchy and loyal to the country of Hawaii as an entity. So folks that were complete citizens, like members of the Young family and the Marin family, Marins being Mexican and Spanish, the Young family originally being, of course, British, they were part of the Hawaiian system. The Afongs, for example, who were living in Chinatown, well, now Chinatown, were Hawaiian citizens. So they got to get land during the Mahele because they were Hawaiian citizens. The only folks that could not apply were foreigners who had foreign passports, i.e. they were not Hawaiian citizens. So a lot of the missionaries had never taken Hawaiian citizenship because they still saw themselves as, quote, Americans, unquote. So they couldn't get land during the Mahele. And this comes back to bite everyone. So the Mahele was limited to folks who were Hawaiian in the sense that they were of the Hawaiian state. They were, if you wanted modern context, they were passport-carrying members of the Hawaiian country. Now to do this, they very quickly came up with the idea that you had to have a sequence of things happen. At the top, you had to have the royal family get first shots at all the land in the Hawaiian Islands. So think of a big pie. So the king and his relatives, i.e. the royal family, gets the first shots at property. And so they go in and they say, okay, we own this. And Ruth K. Kalani says, I own this. And someone else says, I own that. And this land commission that's set up, sort of like a set of judges, basically decides and gives people land here, says, no, you shouldn't get that. And at the end of it, the members of the royal family and their related relatives end up with about 1 million acres. The next group is the most logical, second group. So, I mean, the first group you have to do because that's the king, that's the guy running the place. The second group that gets dibs on this pie is the government. Things like harbors, military installations, schools, hospitals, whatever it is that the government's got, they obviously have to keep those things because they've already spent time and money invested in them. They need them for the country to stay a country. So the government gets the next shot at the pie. So they end up with about 1.5 million acres of government land. Now, this also includes the watershed land in a lot of areas because that was already recognized as something that has to be kept by the government because that's where the water comes from. After these two areas have been defined by this land commission, the third group of folks up to bat are all the other chiefs, all the other ari'i. Now, in a rather complicated way, this also includes, for example, the king and the other members of the royal family as family members. So the Kamehamehas, for example, get to get land as an individual, along with the land they get as the monarchy government. It's become a huge source of confusion in the 20th and 21st century. So chiefly lands are different than the crown. When the dust settles on all this, the chiefs end up with about 1.6 million acres. And that includes the king as a person, not the king as the sovereign. Now you've still got about, 10 million acres left. The original design was, once that land had been given out to these first three groups, then you go to everyone else, i.e. the Maka'ainana, which at this point would include guys like the Afongs and such like that. You go and tell them, okay, now it's your chance. Now you come up to bat and you tell us what property you own and we'll decide to give it to you. So again, if you remember that map of Palolo I showed, that's when most of those people, now the Mahoi guy was actually a chief, so he got his land in stage 3. But most of the other folks there in Palolo got their land in stage 4. And so that's when originally the design was, and what the king had intended, and what the government had intended, is maybe 3 or 4 million acres would have been given out to the Maka'ainana in the 4th stage. And that's why it was set up this way, to make sure they weren't dispossessed. Unfortunately, for a set of reasons, which largely, as we'll see next time, has to do with this whole sort of Calvinist morality thing, most of the Maka'ainana are intentionally not informed of what's going to happen by the people who should have told them. So the end result, if you look at that, by the time the dust settles, they've only got 30,000 acres, which is basically nothing. Now, the sad thing about that is when this was all done, so by 1850, 1851, all this land has been allocated from everyone that asked for it. At that point, you couldn't go and submit like a late assignment. At that point, the Mahele shuts down, the land commission quits, and at that point now, all the land that's left that no one has taken, if it's not crown, government, chiefly, or Maka'ainana, that now goes up to auction, and folks who are not Hawaiian citizens can bid for the property, and pop, that's where all the land disappears. So the vast majority of land, including most of Palolo, goes into private hands at auction after the Mahele, because the folks that should have taken it were not told of what they had to do clearly enough, didn't have the money or the resources at the time or understanding to do it, and so they get screwed. By 1852, the majority of Hawaiians in the commoner population are entirely dispossessed. The chiefs aren't. the chiefs did great out of this whole thing. And if you think about it, a good example would be Princess Pauahi Estate, which of course is Bishop Estate / Cam Schools. So some of the chiefs did incredibly well out of the with literally, I believe 700,000 acres or something like that is what her whole endowments were. So it's not fair to say Hawaiians got reaped. The Maka'anana, they got totally reaped. Most anyone in a position of authority or power did really well out of the whole thing. They then lose their property because they sell it afterwards because they want money, but they didn't have land stolen from them. And even the Maka'anana, it's just stolen, but it's a different type of stolen. So I'll get into how that happens a little bit next time. But the main thing is by 1855, all the land in Hawaii is owned by someone or something. And the majority of Hawaiians are not part of that. And that just leads to an enormous mess, which we're still trying to deal with in 2020. Okay, hopefully that makes a fair amount of sense. Any questions on all that? No. Okay, I guess if there's no questions, then we're POW for today. As I noted at the very beginning, I actually have, if you go to the Canvas, in the first section, which I think is interesting, I'll change that. So I'll actually set up a separate module for the project, the Palolo project. If you look, the newest article or the newest thing in that is actually a list of the jobs in terms of things that people are going to do. I have from the folks that told me already what they want to do in a general sense. So if you can look at that over the weekend and tell me if there's one of those actual specific jobs that you want to do versus me telling you what to do, then let me know and I'll put your name on it, because I'm going to have people named out and telling you specifically what you're doing by Monday. So if I don't hear by Monday afternoon, you will be told what you're going to be working on. If you haven't looked that over and said, I want to work on this aspect of the project versus another one, I'm very liable to just give you something and tell you, congratulations, this is what you're going to do for this part of your grade in this class. So do look it over, and if you don't have it already, tell me. If you do have it in a general sense, like I want to look at land use or genealogy or something like that, now that I've got it actually specified, let me know which of those you find the most interesting, and I'll plug you into that. So it's either do it or it's a snooze you lose, basically, in terms of getting your choice. So take a look at that. I just posted it just literally like 2 minutes before class started. So I'll go and sort of reorganize everything, but you can see it's the jobs, Palolo project jobs assignment list or something like that. Okay. So with that, I guess I'll see you guys on Monday. Yep.